Dr. Brian Moench, former faculty at the University of Utah Honors Program of Public Health and the Environment and at Harvard Medical School, has presented hundreds of lectures, PowerPoint presentations, and op-eds for newspapers and helped communities throughout the U.S. organize opposition to polluting industries. As an expert witness, writing court briefs for pollution lawsuits, Dr. Moench met with top EPA officials on nationwide pollution rulemaking. President Obama nominated him in 2013 for the Champion of Change Award for his work on public health and the climate crisis. And as president and founder of Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment since 2007, he's watched it grow into the largest civic organization of medical professionals in the Western U.S. Dr. Moench has appeared on national TV, including MSNBC and Fox Business Channel, is frequently quoted in national newspapers, and regularly appears on local TV and radio programs in Utah regarding health consequences of air pollution. He's an ongoing thorn in the side of Utah state government, industrial polluters, oil and gas drillers, and wood burners. If you have a question, use the Q&A box, mention Dr. Moench, and send it during his presentation. And now, Dr. Moench.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Brian Moench, president of Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment. I appreciate all of you being here this morning. I need to give you a little warning that this talk can be extremely hazardous to your peace of mind. Let me begin with a little personal story using the headline from the Rolling Stone magazine's article about this event. It's called "What's Killing the Babies of Vernal, Utah." In 2013, our group was contacted by a midwife with concerns about an unusual number of infant deaths, most of them neonatal, in the Vernal and Uinta Basin area of eastern Utah. We concluded that beginning in 2010, there was a rise in infant deaths in the basin that peaked in 2013 at a level 6 times the national average. We also learned that the local pediatric clinic was seeing an unusually high number of children with a rare birth defect, tracheomalacia, that can cause serious respiratory difficulties for infants, especially in circumstances like respiratory infections. We estimated that this birth defect was present also at a rate about 6 times the national average. We then dug into the research and found an extensive body of work that showed the effect of air pollution and its toxic effects on pregnancy, fetal development, and neonatal outcomes. And in 2015, a paper was published showing massive amounts of VOCs in the atmosphere over the area, corresponding to the rise in the drilling activity in the region, revealing basically a pollution nightmare from the oil and gas industry. In response, I took a handful of doctors from our group and went to Vernal to make a town hall presentation on the likely connection between this extraordinary pollution and this dramatic rise in neonatal demise. We started feeding this information to the national news, and national reporters followed us there, probably because they thought, as we had feared, there might be some trouble, i.e. violence from some of the supporters of the oil and gas industry, because it was the economic foundation of the community. Thankfully, no violence occurred, but most of the townspeople stayed away. There were more national reporters there than there were townspeople. All the publicity forced our Utah State Health Department to launch an epidemiologic study looking for the incidence of pregnancy complications, infant deaths, and stillbirths. They released the results of that study later in 2015. They found an increase in the number of stillbirths and small for gestational age births, despite the fact that they increased the denominator by increasing the geographic area investigated, and included a much longer time period than the one we had suggested. They stated those changes were made to increase the statistical power of the review, but they also acted to dilute the results. These changes highlight the difficulty of conducting or relying upon classic epidemiologic cluster studies to identify associations. Cluster studies, as they are called, hardly ever reveal an association between environmental toxins and disease, especially cancer. Even the cluster study of the notorious Love Canal did not show an association. The populations are simply too small to generate statistical power. Cluster studies are the wrong tool to use to define environmental risks to small populations. Now, I'd like to talk about 9 common myths of air pollution and air toxics. First is, there is no safe level of air pollution. In the same way that there's no safe number of cigarettes a person can smoke, there is no safe level of air pollution a person can breathe. Published in Circulation, researchers graphed the signature outcome of exposure to air pollution, which is a sudden death, seen here on the vertical axis against the particulate air pollution concentration on the horizontal axis. 3 different types of pollution: cigarette smoke, secondhand cigarette smoke, and community air pollution, all follow the same nonlinear curve. Let me focus your attention on the origin of the graph first. You can see that as soon as you get any pollution at all, you are seeing increased deaths. Then the curve starts to up a steep slope at the beginning and then flattens and eventually becomes almost flat. All 3 types of pollution follow the same line. Perhaps this hyperbolic relationship is best remembered this way. Smoking just 1 cigarette a day is almost half as much risk as smoking a full pack, and a pack is almost as much risk as however many cigarettes this guy is smoking. That same linear relationship exists for community air pollution. That there is no safe level should not be a surprise, because there are many other things for which there is no safe level of exposure. For example, country western music. Everyone knows there's no safe level of that you can listen to. And for those of you who like country, you might be pleased to know that there's no safe level of opera you can listen to either. This no safe level concept has been further reinforced over and over since then. For example, in a study of more than 4.5 million veterans published in JAMA Network, researchers identified 9 different causes of death related to air pollution, which for the first time included kidney disease, dementia, and type 2 diabetes. Furthermore, the researchers found 99% of mortality related to air pollution occurs in communities where the levels of PM2.5 is below the EPA's annual standard. Air pollution is itself the 4th leading cause of death and contributes to 4 of the 5 leading causes of death. The second concept is virtually everyone is affected. Given all the laboratory research, it is unavoidable to conclude that virtually everyone is affected through the inflammatory process provoked and the triggering of oxidative stress. We all suffer, even if for many of us it is subclinical, with a silent shortening of life expectancy and probably by, among other things, a low-grade inflammatory response and a shortening of our telomeres. The third concept is that there are important genetic differences in susceptibility to pollution. Beyond socioeconomic differences, in many studies, people of color suffer greater health consequences than Caucasians. Some of these genetic differences are based on our sex chromosomes. In fact, studying the research on environmental neurotoxins, I noticed a distinct pattern in many of the studies that found a significantly greater effect on males than females. That prompted me to start writing a book that I hope to have out early next year, entitled The Great Brain Robbery: Why Women Are Smarter Than Men, Science with an Attitude. Males are more vulnerable to genotoxicity, and about half of a person's 21,000 genes are committed to the nervous system and the brain. Compared to the female, prenatal and postnatal development of the male brain is at a significant disadvantage. At birth, the average boy is 4 to 6 weeks behind the average girl in overall physiological development. Fourth concept is even short-term exposure matters. Now, that may be obvious regarding fetal development, but it is also true of adults. Researchers had healthy volunteers inhale gold nanoparticles for a couple of hours during exercise and rest. The gold was detected in the blood within 15 minutes after exposure and within the urine after 24 hours of exposure, and was still present 3 months after exposure. Levels were greater following inhalation of the smallest nanoparticles in the range of 5 nanometers. Most of the particles preferentially accumulated in the atherosclerotic plaques and diseased parts of the endothelium, in other words, the worst possible places. When you look at all the autopsy studies that have found particulate pollution embedded in virtually every organ, the heart, the lungs, the brain, the kidneys, the liver, and in the case of a pregnant mother, the placenta, there is little doubt that short-term exposure will have lingering, long-term biologic consequences. Even particulate pollution and ozone episodes as short as 1 to 2 days are associated with higher rates of premature birth. The flip side of short-term episodes matter is that averages don't tell the whole story. In Utah, our politicians love to say that our air pollution meets national standards 95% of the time. So the fact that we have horrible winter inversion pollution really should be overlooked. I want you to look at this short video of a house being destroyed in Oklahoma in Tornado Alley. This house has been destroyed in a matter of seconds by winds 230 miles per hour, but the average wind speed at the front door of that house over 24 hours was normal. The sixth concept is timing of exposure is critical. This is obviously true of fetal exposure, but that's not all. Many studies have shown that air pollution impairs the normal electrical signaling of the heart, and that arrhythmias are a known cause of air pollution-related deaths for adults. This study suggests that the effect of air pollution on the heart's electrical activity actually begins in infancy, specifically reducing heart rate variability. The seventh concept is not all particulate air pollution is created equal. The smallest particles, i.e. ultrafines, which are 0.1 microns in size and smaller, stay in the atmosphere the longest after being emitted and can get distributed the furthest. They are the most likely to penetrate indoors where people spend the most of their time. They are the most chemically reactive and the most easily inhaled, the most difficult to exhale, the most likely ones to end up contaminating critical organs, and the most likely to penetrate cellular membranes, including the nucleus of the cells, where they can do the most damage. So far, federal regulations of particulate matter, i.e. PM 2.5, take none of that into account. Even particulate matter of the same size can be more toxic in the winter than in the summer. The eighth concept is that microenvironments matter. While pollution can travel thousands of miles, it still concentrates near its sources and can be dramatically different from one neighborhood to the next. We have known for several years that air pollution can harm the developing fetus in utero, so right there, 2 generations can be harmed by one exposure. But if the fetus is a female, the eggs are also developing in utero, so 3 generations can be harmed. We have substantial evidence that air pollution affects DNA and gene integrity, including in sperm and egg cells. An alarming new study in mice starkly shows what air pollution can do to future generations, even if they are never exposed. In mice, merely preconception exposure to air pollution at a level only slightly above the EPA's 24-hour standard, and no exposure after conception was enough to cause impaired left ventricular function, decreased heart muscle mass, activation of an oxidative stress response, and trigger systemic inflammation through genetic changes, all determined later on in adulthood. The moral to this story is powerful. Not only does air pollution harm the unborn, it even harms the unconceived. I want to talk just briefly about the different types of air pollution in the atmosphere. The first category is gases. That includes ozone, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, and sulfur dioxides. And the combination of VOCs and nitrogen oxides forms ozone. Second category is particulate matter, and that includes both solids and liquids, solids like black carbon and dust. And they can be either primarily emitted particles into the atmosphere, like from combustion, or secondarily formed after the fact in the atmosphere. Fine particles, by definition, are 2.5 microns in size and smaller, and ultrafines are 0.1 microns in size and smaller. Sulfur dioxides or nitrogen oxides can combine with ammonia to create particulate matter in the atmosphere. And the third category is chemicals, HAPs, hazardous air pollutants, as defined by the EPA, and that includes VOCs like methane, benzene, PAHs, 1,3-butadiene, dioxins, and heavy metals. This is an aerial view of a Texas fracking field. The high volume pollutants, particulate matter and ozone, are the only ones that get much attention from regulators, and they are regulated on the basis of atmospheric concentrations. As medical research advances, EPA bureaucracy fails to keep up, and those atmospheric regulations become increasingly anachronistic. Under the current administration, that gap has never been wider. Not surprisingly, improving nationwide air pollution trends have been reversed, and levels are increasing for the first time in decades. This is a slide of a fracking field in the Uinta Basin. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, there is no safe level of particulate air pollution, and is likely true for the other components of air pollution as well. That being the case, it calls into question the real value of having clean air regulations. Having dealt with regulators for many years, their approach is to use regulations as a means of permitting pollution sources, not really as a means of protecting public health. Those regulations still allow methane emissions in excess, And wherever methane is emitted in the system, harmful VOCs will be emitted as well, creating the pollution nightmare that I referred to. That University of Colorado study I referred to at the beginning found levels of VOCs over the fossil fuel extraction corridor of Utah 200 to 300 times background levels, the amount of VOC pollution that would be the equivalent of 100 million cars, which is 8 times more cars than are registered in the Los Angeles basin. And that grotesque amount of pollution is not a violation of any government regulation. The Uinta Basin measurements were on the order of 10 to 100 times higher than average ambient air mole fractions reported from the largest US cities, equal to or greater than the most heavily polluted inner cities of the world. In April 2015, after our town hall meeting and after the oil and gas industry activity in the Uinta Basin had fallen significantly, I went with a couple of other doctors and journalists and made measurements of VOCs in the vernal area, including downtown Vernal, and several hundred yards away from a nearby fracking wastewater pond that looked like this. When we got about 200 yards away from the pond, we were nearly physically overcome by the fumes. We then drew straws to see who would run up to the fence line and hang our VOC measuring canister, which has to stay in place for about 30 minutes. I drew the short straw, and so I put the cloth over my face and ran as fast as I could, hung the canister on the fence, and ran back, trying to do all that in one breath. We then went back to a site that looks like this. At first we thought it was a farm with sprinklers aerating crops. When we got to about a half a mile away, that same kind of fume hit us, and we realized that we were watching what was a deliberate attempt to make the wastewater evaporate more quickly, just by spraying it into the air. We found levels of benzene similar to those in the University of Colorado study. The backdrop of the University of Colorado study was, in the Uinta Basin, there were 11,200 wells active at the time. There are aspirations to drill 25,000 more wells in the same area. A month later, I talked to the Rolling Stone reporter who accompanied on that trip. He told me that he had lost his sense of smell after being near the fracking ponds, and a month later, it still hadn't returned. The two most defining hazards of the most VOCs is their ability to act as neurotoxins and carcinogens. Groups of chemicals capable of causing cancer usually also possess the capability of causing reproductive and fetal developmental disorders like birth defects. And that is a common denominator of being toxic to genes. Other presenters are going to focus more on VOCs, so I'll only touch on them briefly. In response to numerous complaints of acute and chronic health symptoms from residents near oil and gas operations, a coalition of 20 organizations spanning 5 states measured atmospheric levels of toxic chemicals at various points in the oil and gas extraction process. They found alarming levels at many sites, some as high as 7,000 times the standards set by the EPA. Despite this, regulation of HAPs is technology-based, not health-based. For example, if a company wants to drill a well in an area like the Uinta Basin that's already a pollution nightmare, the best case scenario is they get a permit based on whether or not they're willing to use best available technology, not whether the public health consequences can tolerate the pollution that will be emitted. Worst case scenario is they get their permit regardless. Worse still, the industry also enjoys a loophole in the Clean Air Act that exempts oil and gas wells, compressor stations, and pumping stations from aggregation as major sources that would have otherwise forced them to implement pollution controls once emissions hit a certain threshold. Each well is regulated in isolation by itself, rather than all the infrastructure in aggregate. The end result is there is virtually no limit on how many wells can be packed into an area, and therefore no real ability to control the pollution nightmare. This, of course, serves the purpose of industry, but not the public interest. The pollutants of greatest concern are the BTX compounds, which includes benzene, ethylbenzene, toluene, and xylene, as well as carbonyl sulfide and N-hexane. Quantities of VOCs, HAPs, and hydrogen sulfide and radioactive elements can also be there and vary significantly depending on the resource reservoir. Here is a typical source of emissions, a storage tank that looks fairly benign, but if you put an infrared camera on that storage tank, as you can see there on the right, you see the VOCs pouring out of it from leaks. These compounds are emitted at every stage along the fracking cycle, from the beginning of the process to the very end. Exposure occurs through inhalation, water ingestion, dermal contact, and in the case of a fetus, transplacental transfer. Because these compounds are lipophilic, they cross the blood-brain barrier rather efficiently because it's not fully developed until about 6 months of age. Benzene is the most well-studied and probably the most hazardous, but there are hundreds of others less well-studied. Everyone involved, from regulators to industry personnel to health departments to the public, and even to those of us who think we know this issue intimately, have a tendency to focus on one toxin at a time and not the cumulative impact. That makes as much sense as saying we're going to have a football game with only one player. As the CDC states, the main targets of benzene are the nervous system and the blood-forming organs. Neurotoxicity is the critical non-cancer effect of concern for BTX compounds. Neurologic symptoms were probably the most prominent chronic symptoms of both cleanup workers and residents who lived along the Gulf Coast after the Deep Horizon spill in 2010. Polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, are some of the most toxic of the VOCs known to contaminate oil. This is my favorite PAH study. Researchers wanted to know what was the greatest source of PAH exposure at a barbecue. And they found out the number one route was ingestion of foods cooked on the grill. The third route was inhalation. But the second highest source of exposure was dermal absorption. The researchers also found that clothes worn at a barbecue became saturated with PAHs, which perpetuated the dermal exposure, to the point where the researchers actually recommended that people should change their clothes after attending a barbecue. My personal recommendation based on this research is never go to a barbecue naked. Also, never go to a fracking wastewater pond naked. But we should not overlook dermal absorption in an area with high levels of pollution, especially VOCs and PAHs. The wreckage of the oil tanker Prestige in November of 2002 off the coast of Spain produced heavy contamination along the coast. 2 years after the spill was cleaned up, cleanup workers were examined and showed ongoing respiratory injury and genotoxicity. When we had an oil spill in a creek that ended up in a small lake in the heart of Salt Lake City's main park, the family of one of my friends whose backyard was on the creek was sleeping with their windows open when it happened. The fumes entered their home, and the teenage son was blinded for several hours and didn't regain his sight until the next day. A few years later, the father of the family died of pulmonary fibrosis, despite having had no other risk factors. Various stakeholders assert that the lack of published and peer-reviewed literature makes it impossible to scientifically assess the impacts of natural gas operations. Some contend that this uncertainty argues against additional pollution controls. Others maintain that the relevant question for determining whether pollution controls are necessary is if that area can attain national ambient air quality standards, which do not address VOCs or HAPs. Either of these positions reflects an abject failure to protect the public from dangerous VOCs. To accept either one as a regulatory standard or the law hands to industry and their political allies an undeserved shield from criticism. Now, other speakers are going to address more issues regarding VOCs, so I'm going to focus on a few of the less prominent toxins. This is a picture of a pipe rupture spraying produced water to the point where the nearby town had to be evacuated. Crude oil contains metals such as cadmium, lead, nickel, and vanadium, and drilling fluids may also contain chromium and zinc, although composition can vary by oil field. The neurotoxins arsenic and manganese are prominent contaminants of the water that can flow back from the fracking wells. Depending on how this water is used or disposed of, this produced water, which is another great euphemism, can eventually contaminate streams, aquifers, and other sources of drinking water. The fracking fluid itself is a witch's brew of chemicals. including corrosion inhibitors, acids, gelling agents, and biocides. And some preliminary tests suggest that there may be well over 1,000 different chemicals in a typical fracking batch. There are a lot of points in the process where radiation can be leaking into the air. One of the toxins being sprayed into the air in an operation like this is radioactive isotopes. There are a lot of points in the process where radiation can be leaking into the air. Natural gas itself contains higher than background levels of radon. So any leaks at anywhere in the process can be contributing to this, from the wellhead to the pipelines to the compressor stations and the storage sites to the management of the flowback and produced water. In comparison to the Earth's crust, from the natural attenuation process from long-term surface exposure, naturally occurring uranium-238 is increased in sedimentary formations like black shale, which is rich in organic matter. Radium-226 is a decay product of uranium-238 that has long been found in the waste matter from conventional drilling. 2 studies in the Marcellus Shale region found a positive association between fracking activities and at-home indoor levels of radon-222, a gaseous decay product of radium-226. The particle-bound progeny of radon-222 contribute to the majority of the radioactive particles that were measured in that study. Radon initially decays into a chain of short-lived particle reactive progeny. These short-lived radionuclides quickly react with water molecules and atmospheric gases to form ultrafine clusters and finally attach to airborne particles. Those short-lived particles in turn decay into long-term progeny, polonium-210 and lead-210, which are beta and alpha emitters. The particle-bound lead-210 and polonium-210 tend to be deposited on bronchial epithelium, exposing neighboring cells to high-energy alpha particles that can ignite the cancerous process. Other studies show that small increases in radioactive particle inhalation are associated with increased blood pressure, decreases in forced vital capacity, and increases in C-reactive protein. Hydrogen sulfide is well recognized as an occupational hazard of the oil and gas industry. This was a tragic situation where an oil field worker died being overcome by hydrogen sulfide. His wife went to check on him when he didn't come home, and she died when she found him. But at non-lethal concentrations, hydrogen sulfide is still a public health hazard. A normal atmospheric concentration is about 1 part per billion. Half the population can identify it with its classic rotten egg smell at very low concentrations in the range of 8 parts per billion. It deadens a person's sense of smell at 150 parts per billion. In drilling areas, atmospheric concentrations have been measured as high as 15,000 parts per million, and at concentrations in the range of 500,000 parts per billion, sudden death is possible. There are many possible sources of hydrogen sulfide, including naturally decaying plant material, sewage, and swamps in circumstances of low oxygenation. Hydrogen sulfide can occur naturally in water, but it is a well-known hazard of natural gas extraction, production, and processing. Several states do have hydrogen sulfide standards, but they vary tremendously. In Massachusetts, for example, a standard of 0.65 parts per billion is applicable, but in Oklahoma, their standard is 200 parts per billion. In the late spring of 2015, rural private citizens concerned about the taste and smell of their water did an informal drinking water series of tests for hydrogen sulfide, and they sent me the results. Testing a mix of water sources from private wells and the municipal water supply, about 90% of those samples showed high levels of hydrogen sulfide. We brought this attention to the Utah Department of Environmental Quality in the fall of 2015, but nothing has been done about it. Hydrogen sulfide acts by inhibiting cellular respiration. It's a mitochondrial poison similar to cyanide and carbon monoxide. All organ systems can be affected, but the most at risk for generating symptoms are the mucous membranes and those with high oxygen demands like the lungs and the brain. Finally, ozone can be formed hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from where the precursors, VOCs and NOx, are emitted. That's why rural Utah now has higher ozone levels on average than the Los Angeles basin. Ozone has historically been considered the weaker sister compared to particulate matter. Ozone's toxic potential, however, has been recently elevated. Recent studies about ozone are very alarming, showing that ozone contributes to just about all the same poor health outcomes as particulate matter, specifically on the heart, lungs, brain, pregnancy, and viability of the fetus. But this new study shows that the lung is exquisitely sensitive to even small increments of ozone. Researchers followed nearly 7,000 patients for almost 20 years and found emphysematous destruction of lung tissue and loss of lung function measured by CAT scans and spirometry in both smokers and non-smokers at this shocking rate. Just 3 parts per billion in ozone exposure over 10 years caused as much lung damage as smoking a pack a day of cigarettes for 29 years. Both chronic and acute ozone exposure during pregnancy can increase the risk of stillbirth as much as 39%, even at levels below the EPA standards. Even the ozone levels in the week prior to delivery increase the risk. About 8,000 stillbirths a year occur nationally due to ozone. So in summary, looking at large sections of this country from an airplane, it looks like the Earth has a strange new disease. At ground level, we have created and are largely ignoring a pollution nightmare. Wherever you create a pollution nightmare, you will find a public health nightmare if you look hard enough or wait long enough. Thank you.